Today on Off the Clock, we're going to be talking about a buzzy topic: when an employee is secretly working for someone else when they're supposed to be working for you.
Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. So we're talking about, let me make sure I understand, a full-time employee, somebody we've hired full-time, who we find out is actually working another job.
During the hours they're supposed to be working for us. So we are not getting their full-time hours that we're paying for. Let's be clear. Some people do balance more than one job and it's not a problem, but that's not what we're talking about.
And I would guess that this has become a hotter topic, so to speak, because of remote workers. Is that right? We're seeing employees who are working remotely for us on a full-time basis, and we come to find out that they're actually using that time to juggle another job, or maybe even more than one other job.
Yeah, there's even places, online group chats and support groups, where people talk about this and give each other tips on how to get away with it.
On how to pull this off.
Yes. On how to pull it off. It's very interesting, and we often talk about what's the theme of the week. I wouldn't say I got a lot of calls about it this past week, but this past year, I started getting client questions about it. And in two situations. One is where there's a substantial amount of time the employer believes that they were being cheated out of because this employee was working for someone else, or the employee was working for a competitor or someone in the same for another employer where our client was concerned that maybe confidential information or strategy or that sort of thing, where it was being used for someone else's benefit.
Just to
That's when the lawyers get the call, just to be
to
we don't
rub
get every
salt
call.
in the wound, right? Not only are they lying about when they're working for us, but they're spending the time instead helping out a competitor.
Right, and maybe not a direct competitor, but for instance, maybe we're sending them to expensive training courses and such, and then they're using that know-how, right, then for someone else's benefit. That's when the lawyers get the call. I am confident our listeners are saying, oh yeah, we've dealt with this without calling a lawyer, right? And that's probably true. But by the time it gets to us, it's usually ramped up. Yeah. Right?
It usually makes for a good story, lucky
and
for us.
I found it fascinating when I heard there's an online community of people who are doing this to support each other. Yeah. So this is a thing that is happening, you're right, mostly with remote workers for obvious reasons. It's a lot harder to tell what they're doing when they are remote, right? So when I've talked to clients who've been caught in this and called me, they want to know, what could we have been looking for? How could we have noticed this sooner? Because oftentimes in my situations, they found out it's been going on quite a while, maybe a year, right? We're not talking a month, right? So what can our clients and employers be looking for? When should they be suspicious?
The obvious thing that I would think of is the remote employee not being available when they're expected to be available. We don't know where they are. And by the way, I hear that not infrequently with regard to remote employees, those concerns. We don't know where they are. We're sending them emails or DMs or whatever it is, and they're not responding as we would expect them.
Or they're canceling on meetings, not showing up for meetings. And it's usually, when I'm talking to the person, they're not thinking the person is working another job. They're just annoyed that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Right. But when that is happening, you might want to think about the possibility that they're actually working for someone else during the hours they are supposed to be working for you. I learned through a show I listen to. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm a big podcast fan, not just of ours. And I listened to a podcast about this, and some of the advice people were giving each other is how to be in two meetings at one time. And it has to do with toggling the camera on and off. So if you, for your remote workers, when you're having video calls, if your general expectation is to have cameras on and someone is not turning their camera on, that can actually be a warning sign. And especially if their camera is not on and they're not engaged in the meeting.
But again, just like the not being available or responsive, I'm not sure most employers assume the something else is another job.
And of course, it's like anything, it's going to be a combination of factors. Sometimes someone might do that because they're in their car driving, their kid to school or something like that. Now, that is also a problem if they're supposed to be working and engaged in a meeting and not actually working, but that's different than working another job. So of course, it's going to be a combination of these things. Another thing to look for is sporadic bursts of activity or productivity in hours that might be unusual, or maybe even during usual hours but condensed, like a ton of emails and deliverables within a 3-hour period and then silence.
So in addition to maybe the typical job performance concerns, right? The work product may not be what we expect or what it had been previously, but I like that piece about they're suddenly now turned on with this job, right?
All
in, and then nothing, rather than working what appears to be a consistent workday as an average employee might.
Vague, frequent excuses not to be places, not to be in meetings, especially if you have any in-person requirements, right? I had a situation where there were some of these symptoms looking back on it, but the reason we got the call was anytime there was an in-person team meeting, or that which was required, it was clear in the job description, like the morning of, right? The employee would have an excuse. Someone would be sick, a dog had to go to the vet, and it kept repeating and repeating. So eventually, the client started wondering, I wonder if this person has another job or supposed to be somewhere else.
So on that note, what do we do then? How can we confirm whether or not that's true?
There's no perfect here. I mean, surveillance is one possibility, but that's hard when it's truly a remote worker working 2 remote jobs, right? But there is electronic types of surveillance that's popular for this situation, but also for others. There's products that look at activity on the computer, right? And especially if you're using a VPN or a tunnel to your specific work site for remote workers, you can tell when they're active in that tunnel and when they're not. If there's large periods of time of inactivity, that would be a sign that maybe they're working for another job or they're just not working.
Either
right?
way,
They're
not doing what they're supposed to do. So when I hear you mention paying them and their computer activity, of course, you know what we do for a living, right? I have to say, there are employers should check the law in that jurisdiction to make sure they're following it and that most importantly, they've got the right policies in place to provide employees notice that could be the case. But generally speaking, if it's our equipment, we can survey it all we want in most jurisdictions, so long as we've given employees notice that is the case.
And by the way, I get this question about notice when we're talking about this sort of thing. Don't you want to give the employee notice to prevent the employee from engaging in bad activity? Or really our goal is not to catch people in bad behavior, is to prevent the bad behavior in the first place, right? So don't get worked up about the fact that you have to tell the person ahead of time. It's actually usually a good thing, right? And there's a few different products out there, Gyre, Asana, Trello. They can be used for this purpose, but often some employers, especially large employers now, use it for hourly workers just to see when people are working or not. That might be a separate podcast, the pitfalls of doing that, but those are tools that are being used to monitor work time.
To gauge when they're actually working and when they're working for us and when they're not. And I would imagine those patterns could, tell us, are they just engaged in other things or might they be holding down a whole different job? And to me, the patterns would be if they're working for us in short bursts and then there's extended periods when they're just not doing time. It would be blocks.
Right? Because very few remote jobs allow you to do one thing for 30 seconds and another thing for 30 seconds and go back and forth. Depending on the type of work the remote worker is doing, there may be project management software, which is a little different than just whether you're in the system or not. There's software that monitors how long it takes you to do certain tasks. So if a person's trying to get around that other type of software by being in the VPN, and again, I listen to this advice show on how to do it. What they'll do is they'll be working on one laptop and one VPN and then just keyboarding gibberish over here so that the monitoring software makes it look like there's activity, right? So now there's other kinds of software that's been developed to monitor how much...
It's a chess game. Yes.
It is. To see how much progress is actually being made on a project. So like for software development, for instance, they can monitor how many lines of code have been written, right? That sort of thing. That's not gonna apply to every person that's working remote, but there is software like that that employers may want to look for. Again, not just for the working two jobs situation, but maybe just in general, right? As an objective way to monitor someone's productivity.
And then for employers who may not have the sophisticated technology like that available, what about the old school ways of trying to monitor whether this full-time employee is actually engaged full-time in work for you?
Tried and true, and a client, I'm going to tell you, last month, who caught an employee working two jobs, and it was concerning. This is what they did. They had the employee for about a month or whatever it was, write down every single thing they did all day and the amount of time it took them each day. Now, we're used to that as lawyers.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, warning, it's
shoulder
awful.
shrug, right? Like, that's just a Monday. But if you are actually only giving your employer 2 hours of work a day, and we know this too, as someone that it's very difficult to cheat when you have to, record all of your time.
So in that case,
itemize what you're doing.
That employer required the employee to do that. Yeah. And how did the employee respond?
Well, it was underwhelming.
Even trumped up as best that employee could, I would imagine they attempted to try to.
So what was
reflect?
What's interesting about that situation, and it wasn't just that client. Actually, I would say every employer I've worked with through this situation follow the exact same pattern, which is they start with general performance concern. Right? Like that was a general performance concern. Like we're not seeing the level of productivity we need from this person. Why? What are they doing? Did it actually take them 8 hours to do this one task, which we thought should have taken 1 hour? Or are they actually only doing this 1 hour task and then not doing anything else all day? And that's how it started. And then only when things unraveled towards the termination process did they realize the second job, which was concerning because of the actual organization they were working for, right? So I think this could come back to performance management. If you want to nip this sort of thing in the bud, it comes back to good performance management and digging in. And when productivity takes a dip, especially for someone who didn't used to be a low producer, and then all of a sudden it didn't used to take them 8 hours to do something, and now it is, you got to start
thinking it's as if they're working a whole nother job.
But a lot of time, performance management is not top of list for managers, and it's unpleasant. And it's a whole nother show, but there's all kinds of reasons why, right? That might be deprioritized. Because this is an issue, especially with remote workers, I think the takeaway here is to prioritize that with remote workers. Because it might not just be they're doing their laundry or napping, it might be they're working for someone else at the same time you do not want them working.
And that is a much more significant problem, in my opinion, than doing chores or other things.
Yep. If it's been going on long enough, you can do a background check and see who they've gotten their W-2s from. There's
that's
paralegals at our firm, for instance.
I think of LinkedIn too. I mean, that's a very
that's another
sign. Basic, but check their LinkedIn page.
Had that happen a few times, and it's not obvious. It's kind of ambiguous, but what's interesting is it's been changed. So it doesn't say I'm now working for this other company. They're not that stupid, right? But their description of what they do, et cetera, might be changed to be more vague. So they might take the company name off of who they're working for and just say, I might just put up employment lawyer instead of Miller Johnson attorney, right? So you might say, well, she is an employment lawyer. What's the problem? But why would you have to ask yourself, why would someone make a change like that on their LinkedIn?
So what should we tell our listeners about what, number one, they should do maybe proactively to prevent this? And then when it happens, what are their options?
Let me just say this regarding this issue and lots of issues. When someone is engaged in misconduct or bad behavior, regardless of what your policy says, if you call me, I'm going to tell you if there's an objective basis to know that someone's been engaged in bad behavior, right? You can let them go, assuming they're at will and all of the other small print. However, I've been working with companies and HR departments long enough to know that it's much more comfortable for the employer if there's a policy in place, something in writing.
Prohibiting
right?
what we call outside employment.
Right. So in this case, it's really great in one place or another, and we can talk about the pros and cons of different locations of this policy, just to say, you may not work for anyone else without letting us know.
Or getting permission.
Written permission. Yeah, depending on
the
specific situation and role and all of that.
Okay.
So that can be in a handbook.
Sure.
It can also
would apply to everyone.
That would apply
obviously.
to everyone, and I like that. If you have remote worker agreements, that's a great place.
Yeah, that's what I like too.
Right? So something that is contractual in nature, right?
Or specifically, I've seen handbooks that specifically have, or separate policies that are remote work policies that talk about how remote work works specifically. And you could put it, in fact, I really like specifically putting it there, reiterating the absolutely no outside work piece in the remote work policy.
There's some of our, some employers have employment contracts. If you have a contract, that's obviously the best place. There's just a news story in Michigan recently about a police chief actually working as the police chief in 2 different cities at the same time without either one knowing.
Did the cities know about it?
No, and then he got fired from both. So
it's like having a family in a whole, it's like when you hear the stories about somebody who's got a family here in Kalamazoo and come to find out there's also a family in Topeka, right?
Who has
and
the
they
energy?
Didn't know. I don't know who has the time and the energy.
Who has the time?
I don't know.
But
so this
it's
police
exactly like
chief was holding down the police chief job in 2 different jurisdictions.
Yes. Without either one knowing,
I have
without
so many
either
questions,
one
but I will let them go.
I just throw that out there because it's not just for remote workers,
Sure.
right? So we say put it in you can have it in more than one place, by the way. There's nothing wrong with having it in your handbook, having it in a contract, and in a remote worker policy. I'm completely fine with that. That way you've covered all of your bases. Okay. Why do we like to have it in a place like that, especially a contract if you have one? Is for your remedies. Okay, so then by the time we get the call, it's usually someone is very angry that they feel taken advantage of, which they have been.
Yes.
And the question is, what can we do, right? Yes. What can we do?
What recourse do we have? We've been paying this person, whether it be by the hour or a salary, to work full-time for us. They've stolen our time. And in addition, there may be concerns about working for a competitor, disclosing our confidential information, just to rub salt in the wound, right?
When you have an agreement, in a contract that says, I will not do this, and then they do, you have a breach of contract. So if you have a claim like that, that's the easiest one to make. So that's why, especially for higher level folks who have contracts, put it in there. If you're worried about this. You can also think about like a theft or fraud type of claim. Now, there's no well-worn path here, right? But this is something I talk about with clients when this comes up, and I think it's a viable claim. If we think about fraud, for instance, that's probably the most applicable, right? Someone has misrepresented a fact that they're working for us full-time, when in fact they're not, and they've gotten something from value of us, a full-time salary.
Money.
Yes. Right, based on that misrepresentation.
Okay.
I don't think that's a stretch at all.
And to be clear for our listeners, you're talking about civil claims, not criminal claims necessarily. Like you're saying, we could file a claim against that employee for stealing from us. That's also that can be a civil claim.
You know, that's a really great point.
Yeah.
I am really only talking about civil remedies, which means lawsuit.
Yes. Okay.
Essentially. Could there be criminal activity happening too? Could you actually contact the police? In some circumstances, I can see that. I don't think that's going to be in every, just the simple fact that someone basically stole your wages, right? They told you they were working for you full time, but they weren't, and took the money. That's probably not going to get law enforcement's attention. However, if we have a trade secret theft issue, right, something along those lines, that might get law enforcement's attention. But that's not the run-of-the-mill situation that most employers are dealing with. There's other kinds of claims like unjust enrichment, et cetera. Again, these have not been tried yet. I expect to see some of these
It's
claims.
really interesting,
I
isn't
think
it?
most of the time we're not talking about a lot of money. So employers say, well, I could, spend this much to get only this much back. And once the initial feelings of betrayal subside a little bit, oftentimes they decide the money's not worth it or the person's not collectible. I think that's why we haven't seen a lot of reported cases on it, but I'd love to take that case all the way. If anyone would like to hire us to take that case all the way, we would love to do that because I do think it's a viable claim.
Excellent.
You can also have, again, in a civil context, breach of confidentiality, trade secret, that sort of thing, right?
Okay.
Damages
so
can be the
there's
wages you paid
options.
them, right?
Options.
Yeah, there's absolutely options, and termination should obviously be top of the list. I do get the question, can we?
Can we fire them? Which obviously, if they're an at-will employee, obviously.
Yep.
Yes, you can. That's good to know. There's remedies available, but in terms of how to prevent this from happening in the first place, what I hear from you in terms of takeaways are, number one, make clear in some policy, somewhere that outside work is not allowed, right? So there's a clear understanding of that. And really, particularly for remote employees, it's a really good idea to have some sort of regular monitoring of output of work from those remote employees so that we don't find out a year after the fact that actually they've only been giving us 3 hours a day rather than 8, and we've been paying them to work full time and they've been allowed to work for somebody else.
Stay on top of performance management and think about whether you want to use technology
to do that.
To assist to see how much someone is actually working when they are remote. It's a crazy world we're living in,
Interesting
Sarah.
topic, yes.
Yes, this is one of those topics that never would have occurred to me a few years ago.
Right.
But now there's
So
a whole
true.
online community supporting each other doing this. So there you go. So it is real. Low performance, low productivity may be more significant than just a poor performer. That's the takeaway.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca.
You're welcome. Thank you. See you soon.